Dr. Darin Ingels, thank you for joining us at Women's Wellness Collaborative.
Oh, thanks, Bridget. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, I'm glad to have you to talk about a pretty specialized topic. And during this really special event, it's close to my heart. It's probably close to your heart too, as someone who works in environmental medicine. So you are a naturopathic physician, is that right?
That's correct. Yes.
Okay. But before that, you were a
Yeah. So my career started. I was a clinical microbiologist and immunologist. So I work in clinical pathology in Chicago for many years before going back to medical school. So I actually have a pretty broad background in infectious diseases and microbiology.
Okay. What got you first interested in that subject?
My undergraduate degree is actually in medical technology. So we're the guys that work in labs. Every time you have a blood sample, urine sample, that goes off to us, and we're the ones who actually do the testing for the various things that doctors are looking for. So, I had a very broad background in that, but I was just particularly interested in microbes, bacteria, and viruses and parasites. So that's where my interests lie, and that's where I started working. And the lab I worked at actually did microbiology and immunology. So then I got to learn a lot about various tests for immunology, and I just always thought it was very fascinating.
Oh, awesome. Well, it's a great background. I'm glad I met you and found you because I don't know much about this topic. I when Harvey struck, I just with my own mold background, I was like, oh gosh, people are gonna be getting mold.
Yeah.
But then I started to think, well, what else is going on? Well, what's in that flood water? I looked up a little bit of information about how mosquito populations may change and just wanted to address for those who are affected by this past storm or any of sadly, the future storms that are probably coming, that they can be aware of what to watch out for themselves, for their family. So yeah, where do you want to start off this topic?
Well, I think probably the best place to start is just talk a little bit about some of the things we have to watch out for if you've been in these affected areas. Maybe fortunately or unfortunately, we have a history with Katrina when it hit New Orleans and the kind of the things that came out of Katrina. So we have some evidence and some research that came out of that event. And so I think it's somewhat similar to what we're seeing with Harvey and now with Irma hitting Florida. They might be suffering from some of these similar issues. So the biggest thing that we have to watch out for is the fact that there was so much flooding. Of course, the mold's going to be a bigger long-term problem, but in the short term, we have to watch out the fact that the sewer systems got flooded. And as that sewage got flooded, it just carried into all that water that now is running into people's homes and contaminating all of their walls, their furniture. Anything that might have made contact with that water is highly likely to be contaminated with basically sewer water. And
Yeah.
in that, you get a lot of what we call coliform bacteria. So these are the bacteria that would normally live in our gut. So E. coli is probably the one that most people are familiar with. So people have to really be careful about uh, any kind of contact you have with that water, just because any type of ingestion or getting into your mucous membranes. So I really think about the people who are down there now starting to do some of the cleanup. Have to be very, very careful in protecting themselves so that they don't accidentally either, ingest it, get it to a mucous membrane. I think about open cuts and wounds being a great entry source for these kind of bacteria to cause infection. So that's probably going to be one of the biggest health risks right now post Harvey is just this massive amount of bacteria that's in that water. And even after the water recedes, that's those bacteria are still going to live on the surfaces that they touch. So again, whether it's walls or furniture, as the process of decontamination starts, everyone just has to be very, very careful about making sure they take proper measures to protect themselves so that they don't accidentally, pick up these kind of bacteria.
So you said it can stay on furniture that got wet, or I mean, maybe for different organisms, it's different lengths of time, but give us an idea of the length of time these things will stay living.
Well, bacteria can stay, depending on the bacteria. I mean, they can live for many, many weeks, weeks to months if the environment's right. Bacteria themselves, I mean, the reason they proliferate so much in our gut, it's a warm, damp environment. There's water, there's fuel source. So as long as these bacteria have a damp environment and there's some element of fuel, they can continue to grow. So part of the process of helping get rid of those bacteria is just drying things out. The best thing that anybody can do when they go to clean up their home is get a dehumidifier and just try and get that moisture out of the air.
Okay.
Bacteria really don't like dry environments. In the human body, when you get, ear infections and throat infections, that really can't happen if the mucous membranes are dry. What happens is, someone gets an allergy, they start getting that clear fluid. Now you've got a good breeding ground. When you do get exposed to the bacteria, it just grows very readily. So if we can start to dry out these environments, it's just going to be easier to clean up and there's going to be less likelihood of getting these kind of bacteria. And again,
Okay.
if we kind of look at the history of what happened with Katrina or post Katrina, E. coli was really a big one. The other bacteria we saw a lot of was MRSA. That's this
Ugh.
methicillin resistant Staph aureus. So it's highly contagious. It can actually eat away at the flesh in certain cases. We saw lots of staph infections. Staphylococcus is a type of bacteria that just causes a lot of skin infections. We even saw an organism called Vibrio. And although most people wouldn't know this by its Latin name, Vibrio is an organism that back in the old days used to cause cholera, which was a very dangerous gastrointestinal disorder. Now, there's a different species of Vibrio that we see in after a hurricane. It's not the same organism that causes cholera. Vibrio cholera is what causes cholera. Vibrio parahemolyticus is a different organism that actually can cause gastrointestinal infections. And actually, we saw a lot of skin infections, mostly in people who were doing the cleanup after Katrina. So those are some of the bacteria that can be common in flooded environments that people just need to be aware of.
Okay. I have a lot of follow-up questions. So I'm just gonna give you. So when you say the sewers overflowed, I guess I want to clarify. There's the sewers like on the side of the road, and then there's like the sewers, like the human waste, which I frankly I don't even understand that whole network and where it goes. Like there's some tanks underground, right? Sometimes under our house that store.
Right. Well, ultimately, most sewer systems are all tied into a treatment plant. So whether it's the sewer that leads out of your house when you flush your toilet, or it's the sewer on the side of the street that collects rainwater, all of that water is essentially contaminated water. So it all basically goes to a central treatment plant where the water is sterilized, purified, and then can get reprocessed into potable water that we can, drink and use as humans. So at the end of the day, really all of these sewer canals and tunnels end up in the same place. And when you get a city like this that gets flooded, again, it gets into those sewer lines, those long canals, and they fill up. But as they fill up, that water just floods back up the other direction, and then it gets spread as the water rises. So
Mm,
this has been the case really after any kind of major storm where every sewer system kind of has a capacity to how much water it can hold before it overflows. Just think
okay.
of like a toilet overflowing. It's really the same
Okay.
process, just on a much larger scale.
Okay. And then somebody who's going to be speaking in the summit had her own home flooded, and she was saying that there's a lake in the Houston area. I forget the name of it. That there's like a dam, and they hold it like as long as they can or something, and then they let it
Yeah.
out, and then there's like a flood. So that's I don't know, maybe a different, maybe not type of bacteria and organisms in that lake water. What do you think?
Well, lake water is going to have its own set of organisms that will be a little bit different than what you would find certainly in a sewer system. There are certain bacteria and parasites that can live in lakes or any kind of freshwater river or lake that we won't necessarily see in a sewer system. The
Okay.
reality is in lake water because, animals tend to poop near water. So lake water can be contaminated with this bacteria that we normally see in the gut. In many cases, the animal gut is not dissimilar from our own gut, so we see a lot of the same type of bacteria. But we tend to see other types of specifically parasites that you might find in lake water that you may not necessarily find in sewer water.
Okay, like
So
Giardia, is that
yeah, you can
one?
find Giardia. You can find another one called Entamoeba histolytica. Again, a lot of animals can be carriers for these parasites. And again, if they happen to poop near that water supply, that can contaminate the water. There's another parasite called Naglaria. Naglaria is commonly found in freshwater sources. And this is one, again, even swimming in a lake theoretically could cause an infection of that particular parasite because it gets pretty easily into your mucous membranes. So um, although it's a little bit different, you still can get contamination. So yeah, I heard that they were going to release the dams in some places just to sort of take that pressure off the system. But even getting flooded with the dam will cause its own set of microbial problems.
Okay. And same with these bacteria and parasites. Can they be living on a wet couch or a wet rug or what have you?
Yeah,
You
they
know?
can. And, in the case of the parasites, the parasites, because they're parasites, they do need a host.
Okay.
So they will not survive as long potentially as some of the bacteria.
Okay.
Because again, without a fuel source, they'll eventually start to die off. But in saying that, they still can survive for a decent length of time. I mean, certainly it could be days, even up to potentially a week or two, depending on where it's located within the home. So
Okay.
again, it's possible. We also see potentially a lot of a parasite called Cryptosporidium. And again, we hear about outbreaks of Cryptosporidium that gets into the water supply every now and then, because again, this is water that's contaminated that didn't get treated properly in the treatment plant and then gets recirculated back into people's homes. But
Mm.
because it can be found again in untreated water as these sewer systems back up, it's possible. And the way that most people get these parasites is through ingestion. So it's something that you would have to, touch. If you touch with your hands on something, then put your hands to your mouth and ingest it. That's the way you're going to get most of these parasites. Bacteria, again, a lot of that tends to be through ingestion. Again, it could also get through an open wound. Fortunately, for a lot of these aerosolizing bacteria, although it can happen and it does happen, that is not the more common way that people are going to get infected. So, protecting yourself as you're doing the cleanup can be a very effective way to really reduce your risk of getting any of these kind of microbial infections.
Okay, so you're saying not really airborne and talking about wearing gloves, washing your hands a lot, don't put your hands in your mouth. I would think don't have kids, kids are always putting their hands in their mouths. Don't have
Yeah.
kids maybe around when you're doing all this cleanup.
Yeah, and I think it might be different for someone whose house might still be flooded versus where the water's completely receded. I think, again, the risk is probably higher when you're already working in a flooded area. And I'm hoping that people are going to wait until the water recedes to really get in and start doing that
Mm,
repair work.
okay.
Again, that by itself will reduce the risk
Okay. So better
because,
to wait. Okay.
when you start getting in and ripping out old material, that's where you have a greater potential to aerosolize some of those bacteria and parasites and even some of the viruses. So I can imagine if you start
Oh,
ripping out wet drywall and insulation, and if you're just kind of being sort of flippant about it, that will kick up some dust. And again, these particles can live on those dust particles, and you breathe them in, and now you could potentially get it through breathing it in as well.
okay. So do wear a mask.
Definitely, I mean, I recommend there's a specific kind of mask called an N95 mask. This is a very high particulate filter, and it really keeps any microbe from getting in. So if anyone's doing any kind of, demolition work on their home, that's a really good idea. And you can find this at any home, home repair store. They're very, very common, but they really are a little bit safer than just a painter's mask in terms of keeping microbes away from their mouth and their face.
Okay. And you talked about using a dehumidifier. So let me give kind of step. Wait for the water to recede, it sounds like, and then go in with a mask, gloves, um, maybe a dehumidifier if you've got electricity and can get it in there. Is it I guess I want to talk about what needs to be just thrown away versus what can be salvaged.
Well, depending on the extent of the flooding and water damage, because of the potential risk for mold, particularly if it's a cloth sofa, anything that's porous is probably going to have to be thrown away. something that might be made of glass or metal can be cleaned and decontaminated, but anything that's porous, because you can get, microscopic amounts of, microbes or mold into areas that if you just wiped off the surface, you wouldn't necessarily know there's a problem. And I've had people been in water damaged homes, from rains and other types of flooding, that they find, months to years later, they're having a lot of mold issues. So, again, the long-term risk with that is mold exposure. But I think if you've got, books and, clothing, you can probably, of course, wash and salvage, but chairs and couches and anything like that that's porous, you're probably better off tossing.
Yeah, I really agree on the porous items. And I mean, from my experience, I think even if things kind of get musty, uh, that's questionable. I mean, books can hold a lot of mold spores.
Yeah,
Uh,
even if the books were, in another room where there wasn't flooding, just because there was so much moisture in the air, I think people forget books because they're all paper. They're just basically bound sponges. So,
yeah, yeah.
that mold, and I think, what's happened after Harvey, because it's been a pretty long time between when the flooding occurred to when people are now just starting to get back to be able to assess the damage. And of course, it's still hot and humid in Texas. Um, there's going to be a lot of mold sporulation, and those books, if they're there, are just going to be sponges. So, as much as I hate to get rid of books, I have not found a good way to decontaminate a book uh, to the point where we can really be sure that there's no mold in it. And again, it's just uh, safe to get rid of it so you don't have any kind of long-term health issues.
Yeah, yeah, and clothing, I could see maybe if you can get it in there and clean it fast enough, maybe it'll be okay. Um, my brother-in-law, I think, is going to talk on the summit, and his home got water damage from a different situation. And I know that people came in to remediate, were spraying stuff. They had to wash everything for that reason. But I don't really feel like their clothes got wet or got musty. So I think in that case it was okay. But clothes are also kind of a sponge for these things. And I'd be curious to get your opinion, Darren. So for me, like in my home, of such slow, long term mold exposure, even if you clean your clothes, it's just the toxins are still in there. So it's like you can kind of remove a spore. The toxins are harder to remove. But this is a little different situation if things are pretty short term. If you're responding quickly to a known water damage, or do you think in that case things can be kind of remediated quicker and used again?
Certainly, yeah, certainly for clothing, I think that's the case. Again, we're
Okay.
not talking about people that have had months of ongoing mold exposure. We're now talking the course of a matter of, a week or two, hopefully. So I think in that shorter term, the likelihood of developing mycotoxins, certainly in your clothing, is going to be much, much less. And again, I think good cleaning. Now, granted, it may be you have to clean your clothes 3 times to really get them clean, but I think by and large, and what I've seen with people who've had mold damage before, again, if it's been relatively short term, cleaning the clothes is usually adequate to reduce that risk.
Okay. Yeah, and we'll have other speakers come on and talk about. You're actually the first one I'm interviewing. I don't know where you'll fall in the week, so I want to explain a bit more about that. So in nature, mold, there's lots of kind of mold, and they have competitors. But in your home, there can be types of mold growing that aren't having competition, and they emit these toxins as a way to kind of establish their turf. Is kind of one way I think about it. So yeah, in a long-term situation, that mold can be emitting a lot of toxins over time that can be bad for your health. So the good news, and there's a lot of bad news, of course, if you've been through a hurricane, tropical storm, but if you know what's happened when, and you can react quickly, there's some hope in that, some power in that, and it's hard to get rid of things that you own. I went through that. I totally get it. Um, but it's better to act quickly and make good decisions
Yeah.
for your health.
Yeah, and I think you just have to be kind of honest with yourself as you're going through and assessing the damage. What's salvageable, what's not, and I know it's heartbreaking when you've got things that are very personal and meaningful to you. But at the end of the day, your health is the most important thing, and holding on to something that might potentially cause a problem for you down the line, it's just not worth it. So,
Yeah.
It's a really hard thing, and I feel for everybody who's going through this right now. But I think as healthcare professionals, we're always putting your health as a priority, and anything that might become an obstacle long term. And then you and I have both seen people, and you've experienced yourself with these long term effects of mold, and it can be really very damaging and devastating for some people. So it's sort of why risk that chance. You're better off just to go through, do a proper cleanup, make sure that you're not leaving anything behind that might continue to contaminate the home. Because we know it's going to be a lot of time and effort for people to get their homes put back together. You hate to spend all that time, money, and effort to find out that another year down the line, you're now having this mold issue because it wasn't really properly addressed from the get-go. So it's one of these things, if you just get a leg up on it now, you're saving yourself potentially a lot of grief down the line.
Yeah, yeah, it's in your home, or it could be, but you don't want it in your body.
You definitely don't want it in your body.
That's harder to get out.
That's
So
true.
before we move on to health and some testing, I don't know if we talked about hookworm yet. Did that come up yet?
No, but yeah, this is kind of an interesting thing. I think when it comes to parasites, conventional medicine in this country kind of feels like, well, if you haven't been to certain parts of Africa or South America, there really aren't parasites out there. Or at least they're very rare. I will disagree with that. I think they're actually quite common. We're not as aware of them as maybe other countries are. And I think because other countries, particularly third world countries, they've got different sanitation issues and immune issues and food issues that we can't really compare. Even though our exposure may be somewhat similar, maybe our immune system can handle it better and we just get less sick from it. But this is one of the things, again, that came out after Katrina, is they saw this rise in hookworm. And hookworm is technically, it's called Necator. Necator americanus is the parasite. And what's interesting about hookworm is that this is actually a parasite that you can get through your skin. This isn't necessarily something that has to be ingested. So I think what they found, particularly in areas of poverty, people were actually walking around barefoot after the storm, and it was literally kind of burrowing through their feet and then making its way to your intestines and your liver. So you can kind of end up with an intestinal parasite even if you've never ingested it. And so, there's nothing that you would be able to know that you're getting infected. Obviously, these parasites are microscopic when they cause infection, or at least very very small that you wouldn't notice. So this is where wearing proper protection, again, when you're doing a cleanup, particularly if there is stagnant water still present, you basically want to get the space suit. You want to have nice rubber boots on to protect you from having any of that exposure and giving these kind of parasites a route of entry.
Okay. Yeah, there's a parasite summit going on right now, and I just wrote an article about it. And there's still a lot of debate on this one about parasites because we went through this whole last, 20 years of like, oh, we need to embrace bacteria and the dirt and like go barefoot. And, when I say, well, there's certain dangerous parasites, some people have argued, oh, well, we've always lived with parasites and we can't just kill everything off. It's like, no, we can't just kill everything off, but we do need to be aware. Like you said, I mean, maybe there's like for a while, there was a lack of awareness about bacteria in the gut, but maybe there's been some lack of awareness about parasites that we need to be more aware of. And you shouldn't always be going barefoot or eating dirty food.
Well, not really to go too much off topic, but I think it's an important point about parasites is that our microbiome is really comprised of a lot of different microbes. It's bacteria, it's viruses, but it is parasites. I mean, we do have parasites that are part of our normal flora. And if you kind of look historically, when we started to become a more sterile society, we started seeing this massive increase in allergies and asthma and obesity. And if you look at countries where parasites are still kind of commonly found and certainly get into the food supply, allergies, asthma, and autoimmunity virtually don't exist at all.
Yeah, that's interesting.
So there's
That's
been actually
interesting.
some very good research that the eradication of parasites have actually led to other types of health issues. But it's like everything else. There are good parasites and there are bad parasites. Not all parasites are good and not all of them are bad. But there are certain parasites that we would get exposed to as humans that don't really cause disease in humans. For example, the rat tapeworm, which we used to ingest through eating grains. We would ingest it. It can't cause disease in humans, but it can help modulate the immune system.
Mm,
So these kind of parasites that don't necessarily cause disease in humans, but they do play a role in help modulating our gut function and our immune system. In fact, there's a doctor at Duke University, William Parker, who's done a lot of research on a very specific type of parasite, showing that it has beneficial effects in multiple sclerosis and other types of autoimmune diseases. So I think we're going to start finding that pendulum swing the other direction, that a lot of these parasites really are beneficial for us, and we're just trying to figure out which ones are
Yeah.
are the ones.
Yeah, that's true too. Yeah, I think, yeah, it kind of depends on the situation and what you're learning. And yeah, maybe we did get too sterile and then the parasites became more of a problem for us. And now we have to swing back another direction. So it'll be interesting to see how that all develops. However, yeah, I don't think we should go barefooted and barehanded in an area that has infected water. And
Yeah, I would say that's probably a wise idea.
and we'll go on to talk. We'll talk about chemicals in the waters, other things in the water too that we should know
Yeah.
about in modern life. So we'll cover some of that as well. I think one of our speakers will come on and talk about a, a bacteria spray he developed to put in your home to add some good bacteria to the home. So pretty interesting topic as well. So when I first met you as a practitioner, you specialize in Lyme disease,
Yeah,
which can be, among other, it can be very mixed in with lots of other things, right? Parasites and
of course.
other chronic infections. So you have a lot of experience in environmental medicine. So where should we start with this talk? Should we talk about symptoms or ways to kind of test your family or ways to kind of keep your immune system up as you go through perhaps one of these natural disasters?
Well, I think anything you can do to keep your immune system healthy is always a wise thing. Again, we could probably have a very long discussion of, nature versus nurture, on how our body reacts to germs. And, when the immune system is really working at its best, even if you do happen to get exposure, the likelihood of it causing infection certainly goes down. So I think it would be wise for people to have a little, sort of medicine chest or toolkit of things that they can keep on hand and take to really keep their immune system primed. And I think that will really help reduce people's risk as they're going through this process of cleaning up their homes.
Yeah, well, tell
So,
us what's in your medicine chest.
yeah, so I think the things that are, easily accessible and well tolerated, my go-to nutrients. So number one is vitamin C. Lots and lots of research of vitamin C as an immune stimulant, activates different parts of the immune system to help prevent infection. Um, and depending on your age and size, really 1,000 milligrams 2 or 3 times a day for most, even children to adults is well tolerated. If you get too much vitamin C, you'll know it gives you a little bit of loose stool and you just need to back off the dose. So vitamin C is number one. Number two is vitamin A. And the reason that vitamin A is important is it actually supports part of your immune system called secretory IgA. And these are antibodies that line all of your mucous membranes. So it's your nose, your throat, your intestinal tract. But since this is your barrier to the outside world, if we can keep that part of your immune system happy, when you do get exposed to these things that come in contact with your mucous membranes, your immune system can activate a little faster, and that'll hopefully prevent it from getting deeper into the body and causing a bigger problem. So
Great.
vitamin A is a great nutrient. You do have to be a little bit careful on the dose. There is such a thing called vitamin A toxicity. However, the doses you have to take are really quite high. But I think for any adult who's working through this, 25,000 IU's a day, and you do want to take vitamin A with food. It's a fat soluble vitamin, so you need a little bit of fat to absorb it. 25,000 IU's a day is very reasonable, and for children, 10,000 IU's a day. And
Okay.
that'll help keep that secretory IgA very happy. So we
Okay.
got vitamin C, vitamin A, and actually vitamin D. Vitamin D is actually a hormone. It's not a vitamin, but vitamin D does play a very important role in immune modulation. So even if you live in sunny Texas, where you feel like you're getting a lot of sun exposure, we find in studies where people live in sunny environments, they can still be low in vitamin D because we wear sunblock, we wear clothing, we do things that actually block the sun from helping us make vitamin D. And we virtually get very little to no vitamin D through food. So we really do depend on sun exposure for making vitamin D. So
Okay.
again, for the average adult, 4,000 to 5,000 IU's a day of vitamin D, and for a child, 1,000 to 2,000 IU's of vitamin D. And you also do want to take vitamin D with food like vitamin A.
Okay.
I'm also a big fan of zinc. Zinc is great because it also stimulates the immune system. a very specific part of the immune system that directly goes after infections. And zinc itself is actually an antiviral. So in the event that you get exposed to any kind of virus along the way, it does have direct antiviral effects. So for adults, I like anywhere from 30 to 50 milligrams a day, and for children, anywhere from 10 to 20 milligrams a day.
Okay.
Zinc is a nutrient that you want to take with food, not necessarily for absorption, but zinc on empty stomach can make you pretty nauseous. So having a little bit of food with zinc just keeps you from getting sick. So, those 4 nutrients is a great little package. Again, you can find these at any health food store. They're inexpensive. And I find that just in terms of keeping the immune system primed, this is just a great go-to and something to keep on your shelf.
Okay. Yeah, I think these are all fantastic suggestions, and they are all easy to find. I mean, do you have a preference? Like, if someone can find a vitamin C with bioflavonoids, would you prefer it with that, or you're just like not picky as long as they're
Yeah,
taking vitamin C?
again, I'm not picky. I mean, personally, I use bioflavonoids usually for different purposes. So if someone just really needs the immune stimulating benefit, vitamin C by itself, and whether it's buffered vitamin C or ester C, it's kind of dealer's choice on that one.
Okay. Awesome. Yeah, that's great advice. Yeah. Well, let's see. What else would you want someone to know health wise who might be going through one of these situations?
Well, the other thing that I thought of specific with regards to Texas is mosquitoes. Just because, it is a very humid environment. You do get a lot of mosquitoes naturally. And with all this stagnant water that's now going to be around, I imagine we're going to see this massive explosion of the mosquito population because there's just so many places they can lay their eggs. So I think, again, keeping some sort of natural repellent on hand would probably be a good idea just to keep the mosquitoes away from your skin. Although mosquitoes don't really transmit bacterial or parasite infections, we do see certain viruses. And again, we've seen little outbreaks of viral infections after natural disasters. So nowadays, there's Zika virus, there's West Nile virus, there's dengue virus. There's even one that's emerging out of Central America called chikungunya virus. So I think Zika and West Nile are probably the 2 viruses that health departments are worried most about in the United States. Fortunately, we have very few cases of them, but again, with this now potentially growing mosquito population, it's something I think we need to at least keep on our radar. So I prefer that people not use DEET or some of the toxic chemicals that are typically used to keep mosquitoes away. But there's a lot of really great natural organic essential oil products available that typically contain any combination of either clove oil, eucalyptus oil, tea tree oil, cedar oil, lavender oil, or lemongrass oil.
Hmm.
Some combination of those. And they've actually studied it. They've done research and they find it actually works quite well at keeping mosquitoes away. So, I might see if you find a health food store or if you have access to essential oils, you can actually make your own concoction. And there's actually a lot of recipes online for doing that. But I see that most of the health food stores out there do carry some version of this. And, pick up a bottle and spray yourself regularly while you're in that environment and just make sure you're keeping the mosquitoes at bay.
That's a good tip. So I'll ask you a loaded question. So you're a Lyme expert. I think it's been theorized that Lyme is carried by other bugs now too. Do you think that Lyme can be transmitted by mosquitoes?
Well, it's not theory. It's actually been proven in research.
Okay.
So there's at least 4 studies out of Europe. Interestingly, they haven't done them here in the United States, but in Europe, there have been 4 studies that have shown that mosquitoes can transmit Lyme disease.
Okay.
So I think the fact that ticks carry most of Lyme, it's not only ticks. There's been some evidence now that mosquitoes and potentially even fleas could carry Lyme. And it makes a lot of sense because I do see people around the world who don't live in areas that are typically known to have ticks, and yet they have positive Lyme tests, and they haven't necessarily even traveled to an area that's endemic for Lyme. So that would make a lot of sense that there's other potential carriers. And
Okay.
if you think about the way that Lyme is transmitted, since it is transmitted through the blood, via mosquito and another animal, ultimately to a human, any biting insect that shares blood like a mosquito, I think it makes a lot of sense that that's possible. I
Okay.
do find it curious that they really haven't done any research in the U.S. to show that. In fact, I have a friend whose son is an entomologist in Florida who studies mosquitoes, and he says, "Oh no, there's no possible transmission of Lyme through mosquitoes." And I said, "Well, here's the research that says otherwise." And I don't know that European mosquitoes are any different than, American mosquitoes. So I think if European mosquitoes can do it, it's probably likely American mosquitoes do too. So
Yeah, it's a good reason to use the natural repellent or wear long sleeves or stay in after dark. And with
yeah,
the standing water, I mean, some of that, of course, depending on the situation, but some of that can be removed or remediated. Like if you just have like flower pots or different things in your yard that you can upturn.
yeah.
I mean, I haven't lived through this type of storm, but I did live in South America, and we had a lot of mosquitoes. And when we just rearranged some water flow in our yard, it really helped. So because they don't travel that far, right? Like,
No, no, they like to stay relatively close to home. But yeah, like I said, anywhere that you've got stagnant water. So yeah, pots, pans, and this is where, even inside the home, if you get these little puddles, just drying out the home first and foremost is the best way to help reduce your risk of mosquitoes.
yeah, and people may not have these laying around, but you can there's water pumps that you can use to move water from one place to the other that, if you could get your hands on, might be useful in these
Yeah.
situations, like if you have a pool and you've had like a little mobile pump type
Yeah.
thing. So,
I just read, I think it was yesterday, that Texas announced that they've enlisted the Air Force to come start doing overhead spraying for mosquitoes.
oh wow.
So whoever you bring on to talk about chemicals, you might want to have that conversation,
Oh
because you can
gosh.
imagine now that we're going to be, bombing people with chemicals to try and keep the mosquito population at bay. And
Oh, wow. Okay. Yeah, I'll
we'll
have to
see
look
how that
into that
goes.
article. Yeah, they should just do a lavender bomb.
At least it would smell good.
Well, this has been super interesting information. Anything else we didn't cover that you want to make sure we share before we share your resources?
Yeah, I think the last thing I would just talk about is just make sure that you have some sort of potable water,
Mm,
because I don't know to what extent your tap water was contaminated. If somehow it invaded your own pipes, depending on where you live, if you're on a city water or on septic or well water, I would just make sure that your water is safe to drink before you start drinking it or even bathing in it. So there are various labs you can use to test your water to make sure it's safe. In the meantime, use bottled water. If push comes to shove, you can boil water. That will help kill off a lot of bacteria. Unfortunately, boiling water won't necessarily get rid of any toxin that might be in the water. It only
mhm.
kills the bacteria. So it's not the safest way. The one thing that I'm a big fan of is that you can buy now these little personal water containers that contain a water filter. They're designed for campers so that they can pull water out of a stream, and it basically sterilizes it so it's safe to drink. The one company I like is the company called Grail, and they make. I mean, it's not a cheap. I think it's about $100 for the little water container. But something like that, if you were unsure, might be a worthy investment just to make sure that anything you're drinking is safe.
Yeah, yeah. I hope that the city is testing and warning people about what they drink and can't drink. That's great advice. I mean, some of my environmental chemical testing would say don't drink out of plastic, but this is one time I say if you have to buy plastic bottles of water, it's better
Yeah,
than
I think
drinking.
we're choosing between the lesser of two evils, but I would rather have a short term, exposure to plastic if it means you're not going to
Right.
pick up a potential infection, which could be far more damaging. So again,
Yeah.
hopefully the city will get the water tested quickly, and people will know that their water is safe to drink and bathe in. But until that time has come, I would err on the side of caution and have some sort of, filtered water.
Yeah, and the bathing is a great suggestion too because we do absorb things through the skin. And I think Americans are used to having a lot of water to bathe in. But also, when I lived in South America, I have to bathe out of like one bucket of water. And you can get quite a good shower in with one bucket of water, actually. So there's different, or you can kind of mop yourself off. So there's different ways to clean yourself. Or, I know not everyone in the city was affected. So you can go to an area that, wasn't affected. And if their
Yeah.
I don't know if their water is clean or not, how big of an area it is, but if you can go elsewhere to take a shower.
Yeah. Well, I think the city water issue, because again, most cities have, a central area that supplies a lot of homes. So even if your home wasn't damaged itself, that doesn't mean that your water supply wasn't contaminated either. So
True,
I would
true.
just check with your local officials and, maybe call whoever's involved with their water treatment, and just talk to them and make sure that the water is safe to drink and bathe in.
Okay. So, Darin, you were telling me you got a clinic in Connecticut and California. Do you want to just tell us more about your work?
Yeah, so I have an office in Fairfield, Connecticut, and Irvine, California. So I'm a bi-coastal practitioner, and if anyone's interested, my website is dariningelsnd.com. It's DARININGELS, N is in Nancy, D.com. And if people want to sign up, I'll give you information. I have a new book on Lyme disease coming out early next year called The Lyme Solution. And we also have a newsletter. We have a lot of really great tips on different matters about environmental medicine, immunology, and microbiology, and things that I'm interested in. So we'd love for people to follow us and take advantage of some of that information.
Awesome. Yeah, I mean, I think everyone can tell from this conversation that you're really knowledgeable. So if you're interested or just kind of want to stay abreast as you go through this experience yourself or as you take clients through it, to just kind of stay in touch and stay aware of the resources. And if you do end up needing some more advanced testing or diagnosis, they could come to you as well, right, through your clinic.
Absolutely, please.
Okay. Great. Well, thank you so much, Darren, for sharing this information. Super helpful and super specific, which I really appreciate as well.
Great. All right. Thanks, Bridget.